Samstapakaya ch dharmasya sarva dharma swarupine avatara varishtaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha. O Ramakrishna, establisher of the universal religion, embodiment of all religions, to you, the noblest of all divine incarnations, I offer my salutations. This morning there was a question destined for the Vedanta question and answer, but it wasn't expressed so comprehensively that we could catch the question and investigate what it was all about. But it was to do with the Gospel of Ramakrishna. And it transpires that it was a period of time where Mahendranath Gupta, the author of the Gospel of Ramakrishna, and Sri Ramakrishna himself have some time with each other. And the whole conversation begins around about, well, it starts from December 18th, 1883, a Tuesday. But the question arose from a conversation held on Wednesday 19th, 1883. December. And I decided that we'll start off really with a story that Ramakrishna gives. It's a short story, but illustrates a kind of extremity in terms of culmination of spiritual practice. So the master, as it is puts it this way, says, once a wicked man beat into unconsciousness a monk who lived in a monastery. On regaining consciousness, he was asked by his friends, "Who is feeding you milk?" And the monk said, "He who beat me is now feeding me." Now this is a simple story, but has a major impact for us. Because imagine now, anybody, a so-called ordinary person, you and me, walking along a street and getting beaten up to the extent that we go unconscious and we wake up, perhaps this time in a hospital. And somebody is bringing us around and saying, do you recognize me? Here, take some nourishment. Please have some milk. Who is feeding you? Do you know me? Yes, the one who beat me. That's the one who is feeding me. Most of us wouldn't have that reaction. Most of us would say, oh, I recall now. I was attacked, I was ambushed, I was robbed, and somebody beat me. That's how our reaction would be. And then we would follow it up by possibly how we feel about that, how we feel about that person. We might ask, did you catch that person? You might ask, was he arrested? You might then go into blaming mode. I'm innocent in this whole thing. I'm a victim. And then you might go into indignation mode. How dare they? And then you might go into a patronizing mode. The world should be a safer place. You can shake the parental finger. The world should be a better place. What is this world coming to? When it's not safe simply to walk around in my own neighborhood. So these concerns, not to mention the concerns that are orientated around our own body consciousness that says, I hope I am all right, what damage was done, and so on and so forth, all of these. But no, a person of this caliber is asserting. This story illustrates something very profound, and Sri Ramakrishna asks a very significant and important question. He asks if he knows the story, if Mahendra, who he's talking to, knows the story. Yes, sir, I know that story, says Mahendra. Now that's a superficial answer, because Sri Ramakrishna next says, it's not enough to know it. Now he's talking to a person, a well-educated person, who holds a certain amount of dignity and is a great devotee, no doubt, lover of Sri Ramakrishna. But also, I often tell stories in a philosophical way and so on and so forth, or give some philosophical principles to devotees. And before I even finish, some of them say, yes, I know, I know. And if I had had the quickness of wit of Sri Ramakrishna, I might have answered, yes, it's not enough to know it. Do you really understand it? Have you assimilated this? Not just intellectually, but do you really understand the meaning? Do you really understand the heights that takes a person to understand a oneness, a complete oneness in actuality, to see that there's no difference anywhere, none whatsoever. And this is true non-duality. This is true monism. And this is true knowledge. So the subject here is not only the condition, the heights of the knowledge, but the process of knowledge itself. It's not enough to know it. One must assimilate its meaning. It is the thought of worldly objects that prevents the mind from going into samadhi. So this is an unconsciousness of another kind, a superconsciousness called samadhi. And it seems from this statement that that is our normal condition. It's not something to be attained. It's not something separate. Our normal condition is to be in a state of unity, a mystic union. So something is in the way. Worldliness prevents it. Worldly objects. Now, how do we know a world exists? It's only because we have organs of information that bring in sights and sounds and touches and tastes. In other words, we are reliant on the objects that correspond to the sense organs. These objects give us some problems. If we could take consciousness, our birthright, and stop it from going to the outside, and for some moment capture it internally, don't allow it to go outward, but keep it poised in an inward condition, what will be our feeling? It says one becomes established in samadhi. That is the state of superconsciousness, when one is completely rid of worldliness. What do we mean by worldliness? Well, there are subtle and gross varieties of it. The obvious worldliness is to succumb sensually to the objects of the world. But the subtler meaning would be that we interpret the world so seriously that we strategize about it. We strategize how we'll get an income, how will we maintain ourselves, how will we keep the body healthy, how will we pacify relations, how we will get on with other people, how will we manage economic and social conditions. And is it possible to live in the world without any of these things? And so, he goes on. It is possible for me to give up the body in samadhi, but I have a slight desire to enjoy the love of God and the company of his devotees. Now Sri Ramakrishna is telling us how he manages to be a teacher, how he manages to send this message to us. He has to live in the world. He can't retreat from the world completely, but he has the capacity to do so, and he acknowledges it. So he says, it's possible for me to give up the body in samadhi. But, he says, I have a slight desire to enjoy the love of God. I can withdraw as I want. But what keeps me in here, in the game as it were, is that I have a desire to enjoy the love of God, the interaction with God, and the company of his devotees. In other words, anybody connected with this ideal of a loving God. And that means that often in religious practice, we think that devotional activities are something like a struggle, or maybe is a bargaining process. Non-demanding love is rare. But when we catch it, it is like being in the company of like-minded people dancing and singing, as it were, even inwardly enjoying an inward rise, a kind of inner rapture, a continuous phase of joy that lives within us, something that makes us light and happy. All the time, that's the difference. There are objects that make us light and happy from time to time, no doubt. We can measure this even from chemicals released in the brain, endorphins. In Bantry, we were discussing pain management, and I happened to remark that actually, because we were discussing endorphins, and I happened to remark, well, actually, love of God produces endorphins. Supposing you keep your mind on God, and endorphins screen out pain. And so I have a slight desire, you see, that slight desire that keeps him on the edge. Now we can see the essence of Sri Ramakrishna. Therefore, he says, I pay a little attention to my body, a slight desire, and that leads me to pay a little attention to my body in terms of being aware of it and taking care of it and treating it to some extent as we would need to treat it. Naturally, all of us have to do obligatory duties, eating, drinking, sleeping. And Ramakrishna is no exception to that. But see how he acts when he comes down, as it were, from the samadhi experience. He has to consciously associate himself again with a body and by extension the world itself, demanding a little water or something to eat, or being engaged in some conversation, or having a mantra repeated so that the sound brings him into the area of all sounds. Then he says there's another kind of samadhi called Unmana samadhi. One attains it by suddenly gathering the dispersed mind. You understand what that is, don't you? And M is saying, yes, sir. Yes, it's the sudden withdrawal of the dispersed mind to the ideal. But that samadhi doesn't last long. Worldly thoughts intrude and destroy it. And the yogi slips down from his yoga, and as is Sri Ramakrishna's wont, he now tells another story, this time relating to a village experience from his own village of Kamarpuko. But this is all in the background because the conversation doesn't start off like this. So let's try to give the background. As usual, Mahendra paints us a picture, sets us a scene. First of all, it's 9 o'clock in the morning. And they're talking. They're talking where? They're talking near the bell tree, the Dakshinasar. And he points out that this tree under which the master has practiced the most austere sadhana stood in the northern end of the temple garden. So in such a way that even if you had never been there or never seen any pictures or photographs, you now have a visual scene about it. For generations to come, this can be read, and immediately there's a picture that comes to mind which evokes a sense of sanctity, a sacred atmosphere. Farther north ran a high wall, and just outside was the government magazine. West of the bell tree was a row of tall pines that rustled in the wind. He could have said a row of trees, but he's describing rustled in the wind. What a wonderful power of observation he has. And that's a spiritual quality too. Most of what we bypass in this world, we miss because our mind is preoccupied with many, many different things. Below the trees flowed the Ganga, and to the south could be seen the sacred grove of the Panchavati. The dense trees and underbrush hid the temples. No noise of the outside world reached the bell tree. A wonderful, wonderful atmosphere. No sound, no noise. I'm not sure if it will be like that today. Traffic has increased. But at this moment in time, it was a perfect time to have an in-depth conversation, to learn from the sacred lips of this person who had did such intensive spiritual practice. And then the master says, but one cannot realize God without renouncing woman and gold. So the conversation starts with the subject of renouncing the world. What does it mean by the world? That is that orientation that gives us a biological urge to continue our species. Sexual gratification and pleasure on the one side. And then gold, that means acquiring wealth, and that incorporates everything to do with eating and drinking and all the other comforts of the body. So it's all to do with the body. Then M asks, why? Then he says, didn't Vashishta say to Rama, O Rama, you may renounce the world if the world is outside God. So he's bracing up some slight objection to this renunciation in a sense, quoting scripture. And at this point we see Mahendranath in his conversation, at least that much, is in his head, not in his heart necessarily. But the master's response is a smiling one, and he said, yes, he said that to Rama so that Rama might destroy Ravana. Rama accepted the life of a householder and married to fulfill the mission. In other words, they make a divine purpose, play their game well, in order to overcome Ravana. But what does Ravana represent, if not lust and greed? So there are other means, there are subtle means. And what is Mahendra's reaction to it? He stood there like a log, stunned and speechless. In other words, we gather from this that he was surprised by this response, maybe puzzled even. Sri Ramakrishna went to the Panchavati on his way back to his room. And of course, M was accompanying him. And now this whole thing took 1 hour because it's now 10 o'clock. Sir, says M, is there no spiritual discipline leading to realization of the impersonal God? I repeat, this is the key to the whole conversation. Is there no spiritual discipline leading to realization of the impersonal God? You see, what is meant by impersonal God? There are two basic varieties of this. There's the impersonal God that has qualities. For example, in Judaism and Islam, God is deemed to be an entity that has properties. We might say love is a property. We might say the beneficence and being merciful, the all-merciful, the all-loving, the all-forgiving. All of these epithets are there of Allah. But if you ask, what form does Allah have? Then every Muslim will shout, no, 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 no. Allah is indescribable, it has no form. Yet clearly there are properties. And these are human properties. In other words, they are properties that we recognize as human beings. That's one version of impersonal. But another version is one which is discussed in the 12th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. That is that impersonal that has no properties even. That is pure consciousness, pure existence, that is completely inscrutable. That entity that has no mind, no limbs, no head, no hands, no legs. That entity that is completely unborn, that is completely unchanging. That kind of entity, immutable, unchangeable. And so we are talking of a different system from that which is a personal God, and also that which is in between. Anyway, the master has this reply. His reply is yes. Yes, there is. There is a spiritual discipline that can get there. Supposing the goal is something like, in an analogy, the top of a mountain, you're aiming to get there. Two ways you can get there. One way, you can recognize that there is something at the top and then leave that goal there and then go through all the highways and pathways and flora and fauna of the journey and experience all the ups and downs, all the vicissitudes, but also all the beauty, and all the time engender a love of the ideal. So there's that way. But if that was there all the time, if there were no obstacles whatsoever, then we can fly there, as it were, in one jump. We don't have to go through all the 24 categories. Is there a process like that? So the master says, yes, there is. But the path is extremely difficult. After intense austerities, the rishis of olden times realized God as their inmost consciousness and experienced the real nature of Brahman. When you discover this state of consciousness in you, you have discovered it everywhere. You've discovered it at the highest point. So the analogy of a mountain, in this case, doesn't give us the full picture. It's more like a sun whose clouds are in the way. When you remove the clouds, the glory of the sun shines forth to the knower, that is the jnani. This is the path of jnana. And later Sri Ramakrishna would tell us that bhakti, that is devotion, love of God, a non-demanding love of God, is like the moon. So, but how hard they had to work, he says. Now today, I have met some who are adhering to the non-dualistic path and promote this path of jnana. But then you ask them, what is your model? And supposing it's a model such as Ramana Maharshi, who went with the relentless question, who am I, and lived in a cave at the top of the mountain and didn't interact with anybody for years and years on end, seeking out this relentless question, who am I? Are you prepared to do that? Oh no. Well then how can you espouse in a practical way to being a jnani? So how hard they had to work. They went out of their dwellings in the early morning and all day practiced austerities and meditation. Is that something you would like to do in this day and age? Do you have the keenness of intellect and the enthusiasm to do that? Do you have the spirit of renunciation to do that? Returning home at nightfall, they took a light supper of fruit and roots. I can't even get away with bananas and milk, let alone fruit and roots. But an aspirant cannot succeed in this form of spiritual discipline if his mind is stained with worldliness, even in the slightest degree. You can't adopt this form of spiritual discipline if your mind is even in the least bit stained with worldliness, that is, with values and responses and concerns of the world. Even in the slightest degree. The mind must withdraw totally from all objects of form, taste, smell, touch, and sound. That is, our normal perception of the world as an outward vision has to be withdrawn. Consciousness that flows outward has to now be systematically restrained and has to be systematically and steadily poised inward. Only thus does it become pure. The pure mind is the same as the pure Atman. So once you have completely purified the mind to that extent, then only Atman remains there. But such a mind must be altogether free from these two things. This is simply an expansion of what he was saying earlier, woman and gold. That is the two prime biological directives concerned with propagating the species and streaming negative entropy, as I say, on oneself by eating and drinking. In other words, sustaining the human body and existence like any other organic creature. Then there'd be no difference between man as a highly evolved intellectual being and the lowliest of ants. At least ants work in community, and within their own community don't fight. But such a mind must be altogether free from this, and when it becomes pure, one has another experience. One realizes that God alone is the doer, and I am his instrument. Sense of instrumentality comes in. One does not feel oneself to be absolutely necessary to others either, in their misery or in their happiness. A neutral position toward everything. If you understand that that entity is the doer, is the flow of energy through everything, everything being instrumentals, what is technically called upadhis, that is limiting adjuncts. The sun is shining, a cloud is in the way. Electricity is flowing, and you can put in a small light bulb and it restricts the current. But on the other side, it manifests everywhere, a manifesting adapter. If I'm able to notice that everywhere, in every form, then that becomes that kind of positive vision about the world, and then it doesn't matter what kind of instrument it is. There's no judgment in it or evaluation in it. Then he tells the story of the man beaten unconscious. So, again, he says it's not enough to know it. One must assimilate its meaning. It is the thought of worldly objects that prevents the mind from going into samadhi, he says. Now it all fits in. And one established in samadhi, you see, the word established is there. When one is completely rid of worldliness, it is possible for me to give up, and you know the rest. So here's somebody who's voluntarily engaging because of love of God. One who is only conscious of God and decides, I want still to play the game a little. He uses the word slightly, a little, this kind of thing. In what? In comparison to the ordinary average kind of person who is fully engaged in the world and hardly ever engaged in the other side. Then he goes on to the story to illustrate the idea of this sudden withdrawal that is called this kind of samadhi, unmana samadhi. He says at Kamatpuka, I have seen the mongoose living in its hole up in the wall. It feels snug there. Sometimes people tie a brick to its tail, and then the pull of the brick makes it come out of its hole. Every time the mongoose tries to be comfortable inside the hole, it has to come out because of the pull of the brick. Such is the effect of brooding on worldly objects that it makes the yogi stray from the path of yoga. In spiritual practice, you may attain some kind of spiritual advantage. You may even be a yogi or call yourself a yogi or be aware of a different approach, an internal shift that may well be. But how do you sustain it? And so, what is the reason why you would fall from that state, even temporarily? Because of not just the external objects and engaging in them, but brooding on them. That means a certain wish that means that your love is not fully engaged. Some love of the world is there. Worldly people, he says, may now and then experience samadhi, but now and then, because you'll engage in the world, and then at some point you get used to the other dimension of it, as it were. The spiritual dimension is a bit like, supposing you go to the market and you engage in purchasing things and interacting with people and having a joke, and then you go into a nearby church and you sit quietly. All the thoughts of the market has gone, and now your thoughts are orientated toward divine worship and God. But as soon as you leave, you go back into the marketplace. So he says that happens. The lotus blooms, no doubt, when the sun is up. He uses this example. But its petals close again when the sun is covered by a cloud. And worldly thought is that cloud. It's a beautiful but simple example, because everybody has seen or tries to see the sun. Today, the sun is out, and the best and most guaranteed way for it to go back in is to go outside. And then when you come inside, it comes out again. Have you not found this? So for worldly people, the thought of worldliness is the cloud that covers the sun. But the sun is always shining. It's not the sun's fault. And then M now starts speaking. He says, isn't it possible to develop, and this is the key to the question, isn't it possible to develop both jnana and bhakti by the practice of spiritual discipline? Now, Ramakrishna, his reply is the center of the question that was issued to me this morning. And it asks, why is Sri Ramakrishna so adamant that the ordinary person will find it difficult, or even it's impossible, to cultivate these two disciplines together in parallel? And so the master says, through the path of bhakti, that is, non-demanding love of God, a man may attain them both, because the culmination of this bhakti yoga is a full blaze of knowledge. Similarly, if you follow the path of jnana, it's impossible for there to be no love, because you'll see if everything is instrumental, there's a flowingness going through everything. And it allows you to say or to understand that that entity is lovable. Therefore, love is evoked. So, if it is necessary, says Sri Ramakrishna, God gives him the knowledge of Brahman, if it's necessary. But a highly qualified aspirant may develop both jnana and bhakti at the same time, maybe. Such is the case with highly accomplished, such as Ishvara Kotis, that is, eternal ones, who are born with a consciousness of their own inner self or God. Chaitanya, for example. But the case of ordinary devotees is different. Now, what is meant by ordinary devotees? Those who are struggling on the path of love. Because, which do you choose? Love of the world or love of God, or both? And which weighs in most? As the world increases, love of God decreases. And proportionately, when the love of God increases, love of the world decreases. There are 5 kinds of light, says Sri Ramakrishna. The light of a lamp, the light of various kinds of fire, the light of the moon, the light of the sun. Lastly, the combined light of the sun and the moon. And if you compare this to the simultaneous jnana and bhakti, jnana and bhakti yoga, then it is that combined light of the sun and the moon, because bhakti is the light of the moon and jnana the light of the sun. the blazing light of knowledge, the sun of knowledge blazing forth, and the moon with its beauty, its glowingness. You can look upon the moon. You cannot look upon the sun. You can look upon the moon with love. You can dwell on a full moon or a moon in any of its phases and wonder. And today you can take a telescope or even binoculars. You can see all the dips and raised portions. You can see in the craters how it sparkles and shines forth because it's made from glass. When objects impact, asteroids and so on, impact on the moon's surface, it digs deep down and sprays silica everywhere. And so that portion of the moon is really reflections from glass. So it's beautiful to see the moon. So many romantic songs have been made about the moon. And then, of course, there's Beethoven's so-called Moonlight Sonata, although he never called it that. Sometimes, he says, it is seen that the sun has hardly set when the moon rises in the sky. Then you can see both. And in an incarnation of God, a special descent of God, that is an entity that knows its own nature anyway. There's no mistake about it. In an inquiry about what is Avatara, I explained it this morning, I'll do it again. You see, Vivekananda said, Ishvara, that is the Lord of the universe, God, if you will, is like a circle whose circumference is nowhere, but whose center is everywhere. What is a jiva, an individual soul? It is like a circle whose circumference is nowhere, but whose center is into one particular point. What is an avatar? It is like a circle whose circumference is nowhere, but whose center is at one point, but there's no mistake that this center is any way bound or restricted. It is not under the influence of ignorance. It is already understanding its fullness and freedom, but operates in the same way as Sri Ramakrishna has described, keeping a small portion of the mind for purposes of love of God and the company of God's devotees. So in an incarnation of God, one sees at the same time the sun of knowledge and the moon of love. Can everyone, by the mere wish, develop knowledge and love at the same time? It depends, because that's the question. It depends on the person. I'm not saying yes, I'm not saying no. It depends on the person. One bamboo is more hollow than another. Is it possible for all to comprehend the nature of God? Can a 1 seer pot hold 5 seers of milk? In other words, do we have the capacity to see the totality all in one go? Do we have the learned capacity over many, many lives to do that? And then do we have the will and the purity and the patience and those qualities of fortitude and patience to get that understanding all in one go? So everybody, not everybody is of the same quality of understanding, but we all have the potential for a full understanding. Our potential is unlimited. But how much cloud is in the way? And so M says, but what about the grace of God? You see, in the Katha Upanishad, it tells us that the self will be shown, if you will, through, now it doesn't say exactly the grace of God, but whom the self chooses. And if you put it in theistic terms, it equates to the grace of God. We can do nothing without the corresponding grace. When a devotee taps into, with full attention, the honey that is the Lord of the universe, then that sweetness, that honey flows. How severely will you tap it? How sincerely will you tap it? The connection between the individual jiva And that supreme principle, that connection is of three varieties. One says, I, the soul, am separate from it. One says, I am connected with it. One says, I am one with it. But these are not different positions, or these are not entirely separate positions, divorced from each other. They're gradations, they're supplementary positions, they're periods of spiritual evolution taking place. But you see that word evolution, unfolding. Will we unfold in one go, or we will take steps? Each person will be different. But the grace of God is the corresponding movement toward us. And so, what about that grace of God is the question. Through his grace, a camel can pass through the eye of a needle. He's quoting, making a biblical quotation there. It is hard for a worldly person or a rich person or a wealthy person it's like a camel passing through the eye of a needle. It's also in reference to a gateway in Jerusalem, double meaning there. Anyway, the purport of it is this, that it is normally difficult to do it, but with God, everything is possible. All things are possible. And so the Master says, but is it possible to obtain God's grace just like that? It's not the possibility of going through the eye of needle. Yes, all that's possible. But how easy is it to get God's grace? In other words, how easy is it to open up so that we can be filled with the corresponding grace that flows to us? A beggar may get a penny if he asks for it. But suppose he asks you right off for his train fare. How about that? You won't be able to afford it. So what are you asking for? So if you ask for something moderate, you'll get it. But if you ask for the whole thing in one go, if you realize God today, you'll have a military coup against him tomorrow. You have to struggle a little bit. You have to unfold in a conscious, deliberate, and systematic scientific way. That's called spiritual practice. And then M stood silent. The Master too remained silent. Suddenly, he said, this is M speaking, yes, it is true. Through the grace of God, some may get both jnana and bhakti. He himself is coming to that conclusion. It all depends on the corresponding grace. Then M saluted the Master and went back to the Beltree. At midday, finding that M had not yet returned, Sri Ramakrishna started toward the Beltree, but on reaching the Panchavati, he met M carrying his prayer carpet and his water jug, and M saluted the Master. Sri Ramakrishna said to M, I was coming to look for you because of your delay. I thought you might have scaled the wall and run away. In other words, there's an inference in this passage, if you read between the lines, that M is a little bit reflective, to say the least, about this conversation. I watched your eyes this morning and felt apprehensive lest you should go away, like Narayan Shastri. Then I said to myself, no, he won't run away. He thinks a great deal before doing anything. The same night, the Master talked to M, Rakal, Latu, Harish, and a few other devotees. And Master also now continues and says to M, turns to M, some people give a metaphysical interpretation of the Vrindavan episode of Sri Krishna's life. What do you say about it? That is, the episode that is so beautifully descriptive of the joyful, playful madness of divine love, the youthful aspect of divine love with the gopis. And M says there are various opinions. Now you see the reason why he's saying this, or he's saying this as an extension probably to this conversation, because he's now talking about Bhakti Yoga. So let us review how difficult it is, in Ramakrishna's opinion, to purely go along the path of jnana. Now he's turning to bhakti yoga. There are various opinions, M says. What if there are? You have told us the story of Bhishma Deva's weeping on his bed of arrows because he could not understand anything of God's ways. And I can see from this that Mahendranath is still ruminating on this idea of knowledge or understanding, what we're calling epistemology. Again, you have told us that Hanuman used to say, I don't know anything about the day of the week, the position of the stars and so forth. I only meditate on Rama. Further, you have said to us that in the last analysis there are two things only, Brahman and its power. You have also said that after the attainments of Brahman Jnana, a man realizes these two to be one, the one that has no two. So again, he's talking really essentially about the same subject. And the master says, yes, that is true. Your ideal is to reach the goal. You may reach it by going either through a thorny forest or along a good road. Diverse opinions certainly exist. Nangta, that is Totapuri, the naked one. Nangta was Ramakrishna's tutor on the non-dualistic system. That is the path of jnana. So he says, Nangta used to say that the monks could not be feasted because of the diversity of their views. Once a feast was arranged by the sannyasis, monks belonging to many sects were invited. Everyone claimed that his sect should be fed first, but no conclusion could be arrived at. At last they all went away, and the food had to be given to the prostitutes. Tutupuri was indeed a great soul, said M. And the master said, yeah, but Hasra said he was an ordinary man. There's no use in discussing these things. Everyone says that his watch alone gives the correct time. All these various opinions. You see, Narayan Shastri developed a spirit of intense renunciation. He was a great scholar. He gave up his wife and went away. A man attains yoga when he completely effaces woman and gold. He is returning to this theme again, where we started. So he has to completely efface this from his mind. And with some, the characteristics of the yogi are well marked. I shall tell you something of the 6 centers. The mind of the yogi passes through these, and he realizes God through his grace. Have you heard of the 6 centers? Now M is going to say that he knows. He says, these are the 7 planes of the Vedanta. No, says the master. The Vedanta, not the Vedanta, but the Vedas. In other words, it is not the Advaitic philosophy or the Vedanta philosophy in terms of these 7 metaphysical planes. Not that. These are all the centers that the yogis see in practice, and it opens up for them. Do you know what the 6 centers are like? They are the lotuses in the subtle body. The yogis see them. They are the fruits and leaves of a wax tree. It's not that they are literally lotuses. It's that they have the characteristic of being closed or open. These are levels of consciousness that the yogi experiences. This is part of the opening, the evolution. We can come back to the analogy of a mountain. This is every terrace going up the mountain, as it were, until we reach the top. And M says, yes, sir, the yogis can perceive them. I have read that there is a kind of glass through which a tiny object looks very big. Likewise, through yoga, one can see those subtle lotuses. And the conversation goes on a little bit, and singing comes. And after one song, Suddenly, M glanced toward the window and saw the master standing there, and Sri Ramakrishna's eyes became heavy with tears as M sang the line, I am the lowliest of the lowly, make me pure with thy hallowed touch. And M sang again, I shall put on the ochre robe and earrings made of conch shell, thus in the garb of a yogini. From place to place I shall wander till I have found my cruel Hari. And M saw that the master was walking with Rakal, and the day ends there. And the dialogue picks up again on Friday, December 21st. So we can see how at the final conclusion, this mix of jnana and bhakti in Sri Ramakrishna himself, a rare quality, but his recommendation is the jnani path is extremely tough, extremely difficult for those of keen intellect and deep understanding, those who are prepared to renounce from the word go. And the culmination of that will be absolute purity of mind, a detachment. But look at the sweetness. And Ramakrishna himself is keeping a small area of worldliness or consciousness in order to enjoy the sweetness and love of God. It is very clear where Sri Ramakrishna is standing for the common person. So I hope that that clarifies the question that was raised from this. Om Shanti, 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 peace, peace, peace.